All right, just a reminder that the review session is on Saturday. And again, I will attempt to Zoom it. You can, if it works, then you'll be able to get in through the personal meeting ID. Again, we've talked about this before, that you can look at the Zoom, because right now I Zoom the 11 o'clock class just to figure out what problems are going to happen. But anyway, you can get in using the personal meeting ID, which I've sent out to you down at the bottom of the ECON 105. I think it says, and when you look in the folder, it'll say Zoom meeting ID. But anyway, it's just my phone number, 517-607-2376, and the password is just Wolfram with a small W to start with. So, and then what I'll also do is Zoom records the lectures and then I think stores it for 90 days or something. So they will send me a link, Zoom will send me a link to it, and what I'll do is I'll send out an email with the link to it. So if you aren't able to either show up in person on Saturday, or if you can't get to Zoom on Saturday, then you'll be able to take a look at the recorded piece if that all works. I mean, given technology and the fact that I use this as my standard, there's a possibility that it doesn't work. But anyway, if all goes well, we'll be able to do that. All right. The classic album of the week is The Strawberry Statement. This is the soundtrack to a 1970 movie that, how many have ever heard of this? Like nobody, right? This is a classic movie, and it's a 1970 film, and what it's about is the 1968 demonstrations that went on at Columbia University against the Vietnam War. And it is set in a mythical university in Stockton, California, the San Joaquin Valley, basically. And it's about a student, and he falls in love with this girl, etc. But anyway, so it's about the demonstrations, and then the National Guard comes in and tear gases people, etc. But it's I don't know if you've been following it, but there have been some demonstrations here in the United States over the past few months, like in Portland, et cetera. So it's sort of interesting to sort of to examine what things looked like in 1970 and what things are looking like today. But in addition, there's all sorts of great songs on here. A number of them, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Buffy St. Marie, and there's a song that you should really take a listen to. It's called Something in the Air by Thunderclap Newman. So if you get on Wikipedia and look up the movie, it'll mention that tune, Something in the Air. So it's really something that you might want to take a listen to. All right. That leads us back to what we were talking about last time. Well, first of all, does anybody have any questions that you need to get answered for the midterm? Yes.
Okay. They are. What are the foundations of classical liberalism, and why are they important to my process?
Well, okay, so we went through that whole chat. This is what are the foundations of classical liberalism, and why does Mises put them in there? Well, if you go through, again, that's what we were looking at, right? The foundations were peace and private property rights, and only free labor is efficient. So we were, and democracy is a mechanism for organizing. So that's all in the notes that we talked about. And we were looking through chapter 1 in the book, which is of Mises's liberalism, which is Foundations of Liberalism. And we noted that for this each of these, why did he put those in there? He put them in there because he wants to create wealth for the masses, and the only system that can do that is market capitalism. He demonstrates why in liberal economic theory, he demonstrates that socialism can't solve the incentive problem or can't solve the information problem. Interventionism just leads to central planning in the end anyway. And so each of those things is there because you need it for the market to work, right? I need to have property rights for the market to work. I need only free labor is efficient, right? And so when you're answering that question, then I'll always ask you to generate, 3 or 4 of the foundations of liberalism. So you should come in there, already have those in your head, and a brief explanation, 1 or 2 sentences at the most, on why that's there, right? All you have to do is say only free labor is efficient, or peace is necessary for the social cooperation that you need for markets to work. Okay? All right. Last time we were talking about the law, and Bastiat, of course, wrote the law in 1850, was when it was published, and notice that he's focusing, we know it mentioned last time, he's really focusing on justice, right? Mises was talking about when each of the 3 authors ends up with a proper role for government. And they're all going to end up with the proper role for government is it's limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property, right? That was one of the foundations of liberalism. That state activity needs to be limited, right? And that Mises was saying that if it's not limited, then what happen? It'll cause, if it goes something beyond the protection of life, liberty, and property, it'll have these unintended consequences that will cause further government intervention and more unintended consequences and further government intervention until you end up with central planning. Bastiat is looking at it from this justice idea, and why did we form government in the first place? And we noted that Bastiat was following John Locke in this idea that our rights are God-given. You don't form government to give you the rights; you form government to protect those rights. And that so we have this natural right out there, and this natural right to self-defense. So now we look at government from a justice perspective. Why did we form government in the first place? A just government fulfills its purpose, right? If the government does something different than what the purpose of government is, then it's going to be unjust. So what we talk about here is that we have a natural right to self-defense. All right, so we mentioned that last time. We have this natural right to self-defense, and we formed a government to protect ourselves, right? Right? And that's the purpose of government. And again, we mentioned several times that in the Declaration of Independence, right, it talks about this, right? We have certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and you form a government in order to protect these rights, okay? So why are we forming government? We're forming government as a mechanism here to fulfill our natural right to self-defense, and therefore we know what the purpose of government is, right? So a just government, we said, fulfills its purpose. Right? A just government fulfills its purpose. It doesn't do something beyond that. So he then says that the right of government can't be used to destroy these things, right? It can't be used to destroy life, liberty, or property. Right? So you can't use government to destroy, to do the opposite, right? To destroy life, liberty, or property. So if what your government is doing is it's doing something to invade somebody's property rights or to take someone's life, or to do something that would restrain your liberty, then that would be an unjust government. That's not what it's supposed to be doing. And then we close with this idea that he says a form of government wouldn't be important if all the government could do is protect life, liberty, and property. Right? And we brought up the idea that Mises had talked about, that democracy is one of the foundations of liberalism. But why is democracy one of the foundations? Because it leads to, more likely to lead to social cooperation. Okay? Let's say when you have an election, that's a cheap way of changing your government. That's a lot cheaper than having a revolution, right? And it's blowing stuff up and et cetera. So for markets, we said that, why do classical liberals believe in democracy? You believe in democracy because it's more likely to create social cooperation than other mechanisms of organizing yourself. Now, again, Mises had said you can't have political liberty without economic liberty. You can't have freedom of assembly if the government owns all the land. But it doesn't say the opposite, right? And we've mentioned several times Hong Kong and Singapore are usually in the number 1 and 2 on the index of economic freedom. They're not generally thought of as having a lot of democracy involved in them. And so that's the framework within which Bastiat is saying that this form of government, right, if it were limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property, if that's all it could do, if government were property limited, then its form is not important. Again, you'll note that generally governments that have a lot of economic liberty also tend to have political liberty, right? There's certainly a strong correlation. But again, it's not, as Bastiat is saying, it's not necessarily a requirement. Again, when we see in Hayek's book, it may be that the form of government will affect whether the government's limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. That's why it's called the Constitution of Liberty, right? When we read Hayek's book, he's going to say, hey, you need a constitution, or a constitution is a mechanism that is more likely to result in the government being limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. So again, Bastiat here saying the form of government wouldn't be important if it's limited to protection of life, liberty, and property. Hayek saying, yeah, but the form of government may determine whether it is limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. All right. Now, one thing to think through in the law is that, or to notice about the law, is it's sort of a stream of consciousness thing. I mean, it's not very long. You can sit down and read it in an hour probably, or I don't know how fast you read, but certainly in a day you could read the law. But it's very stream of consciousness. Whereas Mises liberalism, what does he do? He says, okay, chapter, foundations of liberalism. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, liberal economic policy. Liberal foreign policy. Then the close. Okay, so it's very well ordered and logical. Whereas Bastiat, you sort of got to organize it yourself. When he talks about legalized plunder, but he doesn't end up defining legalized plunder until late in the book, right? If you've already read it, you'll sort of notice that. And anyway, so what, again, in a Capitalist Manifesto, and what we're going to do in the lectures is try to organize it a little bit so that we can, we can follow his argument and see what the problems are once the government goes beyond the protection of life, liberty, and property. So, first thing that he does is he talks about what's going to happen if the government engages in what he calls legalized plunder. And as I said, he doesn't define exactly what he means by legalized plunder until later. But what he's really talking about is the government going out and making laws that plunder you, that take your stuff. Okay, basically that's what he's talking about. What's going to happen if the government can make laws where it goes around and can just take your stuff away? Okay, and so the first thing that you might think about is that he says the plundered classes will attempt to engage in the making of the law. All right. He says the plundered classes will attempt to engage in the making of the law. And then he says, by violent or other means. Now, notice that what Bastiat is looking at is a bunch of revolutions that have been happening in France. Okay, France has had these revolutions going on, and he's going, hokey smokes, Bullwinkle. Why are we having all these revolutions? Okay, and one of his explanations would be here is that the government's out there doing more than protecting life, liberty, and property. So what's happening? People are trying to overthrow the government in order to do what? To engage in the making of the law, right? Now, generally, we don't have that in the United States, right? But there's lots of plundered classes out there attempting to engage in the making of the law. In the U.S. today, right? You lobby, right? You hire a lobbyist. If you take my Econ 415 class, public choice, we spend a good deal of time looking at what the economic incentives are given the political structure and how you can alter the political structure to change incentives, et cetera. But if you sort of think through it, K Street, anybody heard of K Street in Washington, D.C.? Yeah, it's like very expensive, right? And in fact, if you look at it, the surrounding suburbs around Washington, D.C. are some of the wealthiest suburbs in the places in the United States. Why is that? Because you make a lot of money as a lobbyist, okay? Again, it's probably not something you thought about in high school, say, gee, I want to go out there and be a lobbyist. That's what I want to do. How many of your friends said, oh yeah, lobbying, that's what I want to do, okay? But why is lobbying such a vibrant business in the United States, and not just within federal government, but within the state governments, right? Again, when I was Deputy State Treasurer here in Michigan, and when I was on the Senate policy staff here in Michigan, who did I meet with all the time? I met with lobbyists all the time, right? And what were they trying to do? They were trying to, when I was in the Senate, they were trying to get the senators to vote a certain way on, or they had a certain bill that they wanted somebody to introduce, et cetera. In Congress, what did we do? We met with lobbyists all the time. Why are they there, right? They're trying to use the government to do what? To benefit what their clients are, right? That's what that's what you do as a lobbyist. Now, it turns out that there are some lobbying firms that are less interventionist than others, and that maybe are focused on protecting the classes from being plundered, right? So you might find this particular lobbying firm tends to spend more time with issues that are are keeping their clients from having the government intervene in their activities. But there are others that may be out there trying to get their clients an advantage through the legislative process. So again, in the U.S. today, we tend to lobbying is the mechanism by which the plundered classes attempt to engage in the making of the law, whereas in other places, it's revolution that happens. And so, but his point is that once you have the structure set up so that the government can engage in legalized plunder, that is, it can take your stuff and give it to somebody else, or it can do things that give people an advantage over other folks, then what's going to happen is people are going to try to do it, right? And the plundered classes will, as he says, will attempt to engage in the making of the law by peaceful or revolutionary means. All right. So the second thing is he says that it's going to erase the distinction between what is just and unjust. It's going to erase the distinction between what is just and unjust. And so let's think about that. If we think the role of government as one of its proper roles is to do something the opposite of simply protecting life, liberty, and property, it says that I can actually take somebody's property away. One of the things that's going to happen is over time, you folks aren't going to notice what's just and unjust. And remember that he was saying, what is a just government, right? We just said a just government fulfills its purpose. And what is that? Is to protect your property, right? Protect your life, liberty, and property. But in this particular example, we're talking about protecting your property. So what happens if the government we get used to the government going out and just taking your stuff and giving it to somebody else, okay? After a while, we don't even notice that that's unjust. Think about a major program that is simply legal, it's clearly legalized plunder, that it's clearly taken your stuff and given it to somebody else. And that would be Social Security. Right? How does Social Security work? Social Security works that it says, you know what? You earn over $600 a year, then guess what? The government's going to take away 12.4% of whatever you earned. Okay? That's what's going on right now. How many in here have ever worked in a job where they got paid? Okay? Every dollar that you earned, 12.4 cents went off to the federal government, right? Now, you paid 6.2%, and the employer took it out of your check and paid the 6.2%, so you don't notice that it's 12.4, right? But it's 12.4% is going out. It's just that you're paying 6.2 and your employer is paying 6.2, and it's all going off to the Social Security Administration, okay? So if you sort of think through, well, how does Social Security work, right? It takes anything over $600 a year, right? It takes 12.4% from you, and it gives it to Warren Buffett, right? I'm pretty sure Warren Buffett is beyond the retirement age. And over time, what's happened is the retirement age has been extended out. But Warren is old enough that it was 65 when he could start collecting all his full Social Security when he was 65. It's a little more complicated than that, right? If you take my public finance class, we talk more about that. But basically, at 65 you're eligible to get the amount of Social Security. In fact, you can take it as early as 62, depending on when you were born, because they've altered the time. But earlier than 65, you don't get your full amount that you would have got if you'd have waited till you're 65. Turns out that if you wait till you're 70, you can get an increase in what your Social Security payments are going to be. You also have to figure out whether you're going to live to be, you've given up the Social Security payments that you would have had. How old do you have to be to have made that up, right? And of course, actuarial tables, it actually goes up by 8% per every year. Your payments go up by 8% every year that you delay beyond when you were actually reached the full retirement age. So clearly they've done actuarial tables and figured out how much that, why that's 8%. But anyway, point is that it's taken your stuff and given it to Warren Buffett, right? What is that? That's theft, okay? What's the government doing? The government is taking your money away and it's giving it to somebody else, right? Now, I don't know if you're following it, but there's a national election going on for President of the United States. Have you heard either party say, if I become president, we're going to eliminate Social Security? This is pure theft. I got so many, there are millions of Americans that are out there just having their income taken away and giving it off to people who are over a certain age, right? Regardless of what their income is. Nobody's hearing that. Why not? Because you guys don't see it as theft, right? You don't hear, so what are they going to say? We're going to protect Social Security, right? That's what they're going to say. We're going to protect Social Security. Well, what does that say? It says we're going to protect the system that takes your stuff and gives it to somebody else. Now, imagine that the way that Social Security worked was that you got a list of your neighbors, and so you've now turned, you've turned 67 or whatever. Now you can collect your Social Security, and what do? You don't get a check from the government. You have to go and you get a list of your neighbors, and you have to knock on their door and say, oh, by the way, you owe me 12.4% of what you earned this year, and this is how much you got, and so I want my 12.4%, right? You could do it that way, but they don't do it that way, do they? Why? Because the plundered classes would start to notice, hey, wait a minute, this is theft. But nobody thinks of it that way. Nobody thinks of Social Security. If there is a natural disaster, what do we expect? We expect the Federal Emergency Management Authority to go out there and, fix things up for you, right? We expect the government to provide, the president will go out and say, oh yeah, the federal government's going to give all this emergency aid, etc. Okay? But what is that? That is saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't have built in a floodplain, right? Maybe you shouldn't have built your house in a place that has, lots of fire theft or fire problems there. So we don't think of it that way, do we? Right? But if what goes on is, if your house, and there's thousands of people, I think at least certainly hundreds of people, that have lost their homes in the fires out in western part of the United States. And like I said, I fought fire for the state of California for 6 fire seasons, right? I know what this is about, all right? But notice what we're doing. We're saying that this is a just thing to do, to take your stuff and to give it to somebody else. And is that just from what Bastiat's perspective of it is? Remember, Bastiat's talking about justice. Now, you may not think that Bastiat's got the right idea, right? You might think that, hey, maybe it is just to take somebody's stuff away and give it to somebody else. And there's all sorts of things you could think about. Again, if you take public choice, we talk about whether maybe when we form a society, we say, okay, we're going to agree that as part of joining the society, we're going to agree that you'll take care of things if there's a natural disaster, and we're in a sense we've already agreed to pay these taxes by just joining the the society as a whole. So there's, again, in public choice we can talk more about why you might have these sorts of things, but nonetheless, whether you think of it that way or not, his point is that people won't even think through this as being just or unjust. People won't even have that sense. Yeah.
So I understand his Bastiat's argument in that legalized plunder is obviously taken from someone, it's unjust. But to what extent is taxation, is Bastiat arguing taxation is always legalized plunder, or only when you're taking from it to give to someone else?
Well, okay, that's a good question, and you probably saw it on, if you looked at midterm number 2, that that question's going to be on there, or could be on there. How are we going to have a government to protect life, liberty, and property unless we get the revenue to do that, right? So if what's happening is the government is taking your property in order to build a prison, or the government's taking your property in order to fund a national defense, or to hire police, or perhaps to hire firefighters, depending on how much you think that, what is this, the protection of property, okay? Then that's okay, right? That's not unjust. It's not taking your stuff to give to somebody else, or taking your stuff to give somebody an advantage. And again, unfortunately, he doesn't define legalized plunder till late in the book, but that's what he's talking about, okay? So he's not against all taxation. He's against taxation that's used to take from you and give to somebody else. That's what he's talking about. And again, if you sort of think through it, people don't even discuss it this way, right? If what happens is you guys discuss Social Security within that framework, right? And so if you're going to justify Social Security, you're going to say, you know what? We're going to look at it as a system where we have agreed to do this, right? We've agreed that if we're going to be part of the United States, here's a benefit we're going to get, and here's a cost to doing that, and we're good to go, right? That would be the argument you'd have to make. But there's actually a number of books that are out there, and you can read Murray Rothbard some stuff on that. But the point is that the framework within you make the discussion. Now, if you look at, some people say, well, gee, Social Security is a forced savings. That is, we're taking your money and we're putting in the Social Security Trust Fund, and then it's going to be, withdrawn, right? That's not the way it works, though. Well, there is a Social Security Trust Fund, but it's what's called non-marketable securities. And then again, in public finance, we talk more about this. But the point is that there was a United States Supreme Court opinion that said the government tomorrow could eliminate Social Security, right? They could change the statute. They could eliminate the Social Security tax and eliminate Social Security benefits. And you can't say, well, gee, I've been paying it, I'm 69 years old and I haven't collected my Social Security yet, and I've been paying into Social Security all this time. You can't really end it. No, the government can do that because it is not actually what a lot of people think, is that it's some form of forced savings. That's not the way it works. And again, in public finance, we can talk more about the details of that. But nonetheless, it is not a forced savings system. It is clearly simply taking from you guys and giving it to people who are of the age to qualify. Yeah.
Do you have an example of how much somebody pays into Social Security over their lifetime versus on average what they receive?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of data on that. The question is how much people pay in over their lifetime and how much they get out. If you're really interested in the Social Security issue, Cato the Cato Institute has done a lot of work on privatizing Social Security, and is there another way to do this, and has looked at all sorts of data. Generally, if they raise the Social Security tax, right, in order to fund the money that's going out to people who have reached the age, then you guys are going to get less return than the people that were getting Social Security prior to the increase in the Social Security tax. Okay? But his point here is that simply that you need to think through: is this just or not? Is this theft? And you won't think of it as theft. No, you know, again, if I were running for president, I'd be very cautious about saying, elect me because I'll eliminate the Social Security. It's simply theft, taken from one person and given to another. Not going to happen. So that's his point here. Third thing he says is that political conflict will become the order of the day. All right? Political conflict will become the order of the day. And what does he mean by that? Well, basically, lots of issues become political. Just think about whether you should teach reading using whole language or using phonics. Okay? That was a big political debate that went on in California. They passed a law saying that they had to use whole language, and that wasn't working out, and da-da-da-da. Okay? So whether you learn, can you teach evolution in grammar school, right? Do you have to teach evolution in grammar school? Okay. Well, if what was happening was you didn't have education being paid for by taking your stuff and giving it to me so I can send my kid to public school, right? I mean, that's how it works. In the state of Michigan, you guys, you know, if you owned property, you'd be paying property taxes. If you buy anything in the state of Michigan, if you buy anything and pay sales tax, right? 60% of the sales tax goes into the school aid fund, and then that's used for public schools to get, you know, for expenditures in public schools. So every time that you buy something that you pay sales tax on in the state of Michigan, what's going on? We're taking your money and we're making it so that I could send my kids to Hillsdale High School. Okay, my older son went to Hillsdale High. Okay, I didn't have to pay tuition when he went to Hillsdale High. Who was paying the tuition, basically? Everybody that was buying stuff and paying sales tax on it. Or if they owned property in the Hillsdale School District, if they owned property there, property taxes went off, and they took your property taxes and they used it to fund the schools. Okay, so. If that's what's going to happen, then what is taught in the public schools becomes a political issue, right? Well, we have laws that say, oh, this is what you have to teach if you're in a public school, right? And I was on the State Board of Education in the state of Michigan for 6 years, okay? And one of the things that we, were looking at was state standards, right? Are there things that the public schools have to teach, right? And of course, I was always going, how in the world am I supposed to know what the third grade, the mom of a third grader in Menominee, Michigan wants her kid to learn, and what the dad of a ninth grader in Albion wants their kid to know. And I was using Mises's information problem, right? Well, you can imagine how that debate went. But nonetheless, the point is that lots of issues get, how far apart these light switches have to be, or these electric sockets have to be, electric outlets. How far apart do those have to be, right? There's laws about that. right? There's laws about all sorts of stuff, right? And why are there laws about all sorts of stuff? Because the government can do all sorts of stuff. And so what he's talking about, political conflict becomes the order of the day. Think of all the political conflict that's out there. And if all your government could do was protect life, liberty, and property, there wouldn't be an issue. You want to send your, there would be private schools. You want to send your kid to a school that's got if you're going to send your kid to a school that you want to learn phonics or you want to learn evolution, right? The competitive market would have schools that if you guys really wanted to have, evolution taught, then I would get students into my class that taught evolution or whatever. Basically, all sorts of issues become political once the government can go beyond this protection of life, liberty, and property. That's what Mises is, that Bastiat's talking about. He brings up and why we'll comment on this, he brings up what Hayek's going to talk about this issue of, are things legal versus legitimate? Now, interestingly, he doesn't really define legitimate, but the point he's going to be talking about is that a lot of times we'll think that if it were voted on, then that makes it just, that makes it legitimate. Okay? We tend to believe we voted on it, that makes it just or makes it legitimate. And if you listen to people's discussions, that oftentimes is the case. Well, we voted on it, I guess that makes it okay. That makes it, as long as we voted on it, it makes it okay, right? And this again, he says this is what's going to happen. We're going to tend to start to believe that. We're going to start to believe that, okay, as long as we voted on this stuff, then it's a legitimate thing to do. And he says there's got to be a distinction between what's legal and what's legitimate. And he uses the issue, he says, he uses the issue of slavery. And he says, some slaves believe it's legitimate. Why? Because we voted on it. Now, that's an extreme case. There's probably not a lot of slaves that do that, but that's what he's talking about. And remember, 1850, right? We still have slavery in the United States, and he's going to comment on that in a moment. But again, Hayek's going to make the same point as well, that we need to distinguish between something that is legal, right? Because you've satisfied. You've got 218 votes in the House, and you've got a majority in the Senate, and you went through the filibuster or whatever, and the president signs it. That process makes the thing legal, but the process of making something legal doesn't mean that it's legitimate. That you may have lots of things that are legal, but you would say this has gone beyond the protection of life, liberty, and property. This is for Bastiat's purposes. This is a point of beyond legitimacy. It's interesting that he says that the United States, he says, the United States is the nation where the law is best kept within its proper bounds. And he says that, but there's two issues that he could say could lead to the ruination of the nation. All right? So again, in 1850, he's looking out there and he says, the U.S., the law, best kept within its proper bounds. Other than two issues. right? There's two issues that might lead to ruination of the Union. And of course, those two issues are slavery and tariffs. Right? So 1850, he says, look, there's two issues that could lead to ruination of the Union. The United States' place best kept within its bounds. What are those two issues? Slavery and tariffs. What happens in 1861, United States? Yeah, Civil War, right? 1861. 11 years later, 1861, Civil War. What did we fight the Civil War over? Slavery and tariffs, right? The South didn't like the fact that there were tariffs, right, on goods coming in from England. Why was that? Because they sold raw materials to England and bought product from England. And so, and the North wanted to protect their manufacturing sector. So the tariffs benefited the North relative to the South, right? And slavery, right? So remember that Mises says in his book, right, anti-liberal thought is in 1927, right? Anti-liberal thought is going to do what? It's going to cause a worldwide economic catastrophe, right? And anti-liberal thought is going to lead to World War II, and that the fascists are going to start World War II, right? Prohibition is going to fail. He predicts all these things with anti-liberal thought. What's Bastiat saying? He's saying, you know what? The fact that you've got these two issues where you clearly have government violating property rights, government being used to take one person's property, let's say in terms of slavery, taking your labor services and stealing them from you, and in tariffs, taking your property whenever you buy something that comes in from England, that's going to lead to perhaps what he says, the ruination of the Union. Now, we don't end up with the ruination of the Union because, you know, after 4 years, one side wins and we maintain the Union, right? But his point still is prescient about here's what's going to happen when the government begins to engage in legalized plunder. So when you, again, when you look at the exam number 2, when you start looking for the second midterm, you'll notice that there's always going to be a question about how does he, and again, in next time we'll define legalized plunder specifically, what he says on Wednesday. But this is what, this is where the question will say, how does Bastiat define legalized plunder, and what are some things that he, what are two things that he thinks will happen, and what is an everyday, what's going on in the United States that would reflect that, all right? Okay, again, review session will be on Saturday. We'll try to Zoom that. You can, use the personal meeting ID and password to get in. If you have any questions, send me an email. I'll be in the office this afternoon, again, from 1 to 2, and we'll go from there. Sure.